Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Awesome, awesome. I'm Famous Harrison. I'm the president of Wenatchee Valley College. I'm just so excited for tonight. But first, I just wanted to just do a general welcome on behalf of our Board of Trustees, my colleagues, faculty, staff, our students, our tens of thousands of alum, and everyone that loves this community and region. We thank you for being here tonight. Wenatchee Valley College, we're not just a college that focuses on education. Our mission is to serve North Central Washington and beyond. When we talk about our values, it's about community. How do we be intentional in having opportunities that are relevant, that make sense, that are important to our community members? So on behalf of everyone that are part of our family and that loves this region, thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Diana Garza. I'm the Vice President of Student Affairs, and I'll be reading the land acknowledgement. Queremos reconocer la tierra en donde vivimos. Los administradores de Wenatchee Valley College reconocen respetuosamente que el campus reside en los territorios tradicionales del pueblo Wenatchee. Los territorios tradicionales de las tribus Colville se extienden por el este de Washington y partes de Columbia Británica, Oregon y Idaho. Las tribus confederadas de la reserva de Colville incluyen Lagos, Colville, Okanogan, Moses Columbia, Wenatchee, Entiat, Chelan, Methow, Nez Pelham, San Poil, Chief Joseph Band de Nez Perce y los indios Palus. De acuerdo con el compromiso del colegio con la diversidad y la inclusión, WVC trabaja para construir relaciones con las tribus confederadas de la reserva de Colville a través de actividades académicas, asociaciones, reconocimientos históricos, servicio comunitario y esfuerzos de inscripción.
Hi everyone, welcome to WVC Speaks. My name is Marcine Miller and I'm the head of communications for Wenatchee Valley College. It's my true honor to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. María Morales-Sánchez. Born in Michoacán, Mexico, Dr. María Morales-Sánchez was raised in California and the Wenatchee Valley. She attended Eastern Washington University, where she was a camp scholar and studied Chicanic studies and sociology. While studying at Eastern, María was a Ronald E. McNair Scholar and recognized an inherent love for teaching and research. She obtained her PhD in cultural studies and social thought and education at Washington State University. Prior to landing a tenure-track faculty position, she worked at Gonzaga University, managing the Multicultural Education Center, taught courses in the Chicano Studies Department at Eastern, and graduate level courses at Wazoo. She eventually went on to teach at Evergreen State College, where she obtained tenure and taught courses in Latinx studies and education before returning home to the Wenatchee Valley several years ago. María is the director of Wenatchee Valley College's El Corazón Center for Teaching and Learning and is tonight's featured speaker. We will also introduce María in Spanish, and if anyone needs Spanish interpretation, we have headsets in the lobby.
Hola a todos. Nacida en Michoacán, México, la doctora María Morales-Sánchez fue criada en California y el Valle de Wenatchee. Asistió a Eastern Washington University, donde fue una académica de camp y se especializó en estudios chicanos y sociología. Mientras estudiaba en Eastern, María descubrió su pasión por la enseñanza y la investigación. Obtuvo su doctorado en Estudios Culturales y Pensamiento Social en Educación de Washington State University. Antes de conseguir un puesto de profesora titular, trabajó como gerente de programas en el Multicultural Education Center en Gonzaga University. Impartió cursos en el Departamento de Estudios Chicanos en Eastern y enseñó clases de nivel posgrado en Washington State University. Después pasó a ser contratada como profesora en Evergreen State College, donde obtuvo la permanencia y dio cursos en estudios latinos y educación, antes de volver al Valle de Wenatchee hace unos años. María es la directora de El Corazón Center for Teaching and Learning en Wenatchee Valley College y es nuestra presentadora destacada esta noche. También les comento que hay audífonos disponibles si ocupan interpretación simultánea. Acompáñenme en dar una cálida bienvenida a la doctora María Morales-Sánchez. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. María Morales-Sánchez.
Thank you for, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. Shout out to folks who are online as well. Let's see. Okay. Where do I point? Can I get some IT help? There it is. Okay. All right. I do have to stay still because the camera, so I have to remind, that's more a reminder to myself. If this starts acting up, we might need a different mic. Okay. So I need to point this way. Okay. Let's start with this question. What does belonging mean to you all? Who taught you that you belong here? Have you ever had to prove it? When we think about this concept of belonging, this big idea of belonging, we often think about the feeling of being included, of being part of a community, of being accepted, integrated, and valued. Today's talk begins with these questions because they are at the heart of the stories that I will share today. Hispanic and Latino immigrants belong. We have belonged in this region, and we will continue to belong, even as our cultural resilience keeps us connected to our culture, history, and language. I hope in the end we all leave with the understanding that this cultural diversity is what helps this region thrive. Through sharing of my own story, my own family stories, that Mexican immigrants are not just laboring bodies, but human beings with histories is what I hope we can walk away with. First, a note on terminology. Let me begin by clarifying a few points. I focus on Mexican immigration, not to ignore or silence the presence and history of immigrants from other parts of Latin America, which are very much a part of the immigration history, especially from countries in Central America and El Salvador and Guatemala, who also were some of the earlier immigrants in this region, and Colombia, Venezuela, and other countries. I focus on Mexican immigration because my talk is about my family story, and we are from Mexico. I sometimes use the term Hispanic because it's an umbrella term used to address people of Spanish-speaking descent, and the more common term used in scholarship. I use Latino, and Latino refers to people from Latin America. I focus on Mexican immigration as well because immigration from Mexico is one of the oldest migration patterns in the Pacific Northwest. Mexicans have lived in the Pacific Northwest since the 1850s, first coming to work as mule drivers in the mule packing in the mule trade transportation industry in Eastern Washington. That's my nephew in the back. The dominant narrative about Mexican immigrants in this country and in this state perpetuates what Leo Chavez calls the, quote, Latino threat narrative. We see it reflected in the collective imagination about who Mexican people are, why they arrived here, what their contributions are or are not. When I say dominant narrative, I am not referring to the knowledge and ideas that some of you have as individuals. I'm referring to the broader narrative, the prevailing discourse that circulates in media, in news, in the larger public conversation. A narrative that emerges and has historically emerged from racist, anti-Mexican, especially anti-brown Mexican sentiments that are not new in this administration. In that narrative, Mexican immigrants are portrayed as perpetual newcomers, regardless of the long histories of migration, labor, settlement, arrival, and contributions. My community continues to be seen as foreigners. This narrative emphasizes that Mexican immigrants, the BIPOC immigrants, all come because of poverty. They come for jobs. They come to have children here, pursue an American dream. They come with nothing and in search of something. When we untangle these different parts of this narrative, we can see that some elements, and these elements are based on real experiences. Immigrants like myself have come to this country in search of opportunities that were denied or were inaccessible in our countries of birth. There are a plethora of reasons why people also arrive as refugees, fleeing persecution and violence. Immigrants like my mother and my grandparents, and that's my grandpa with some of the grandbabies, did leave their territories in large part to escape poverty and socioeconomic inequality. But when this narrative is the one that dominates, it becomes dangerous because it is an incomplete story. Like many deficit-based narratives, it frames people primarily through what they lack. Yet immigrants continue to not arrive empty-handed. Immigrant people carry skill sets and knowledge into the communities we are in. Ironically, there are examples of people in the United States that then travel to these lands to learn from those traditions and forms of knowledge. In my digging around old local newspapers, I came across a story of a local healthcare worker in the 90s in Wenatchee who traveled to my hometown, to my family's hometown in San Isidro, to learn about remedies and naturopathic medicine. A story, a counter-narrative, is what I am seeking to explain today. Sorry. I am a first-generation immigrant. I crossed the U.S.-Mexico border when I was 5.5 years old with my brother Jorge and an uncle of ours. But so is my mother, and so are my grandparents. When we talk about immigration generations, it's not the same as family generations. In terms of family generations, my grandparents are the first generation, my mother the second, I the third, and my nieces and nephews and cousins the fourth. But for sociologists and as migration scholars, generations refers to where someone is born relative to the immigration event. That count begins with the immigration event, not simply with birth order. My sister, for example, who was born here, is considered a second-generation immigrant, and her son, my nephew, who is in the back, is considered by sociologists to be a third-generation immigrant. Although generations after the first are technically not immigrants, sociologists and scholars in migration studies continue to use that language of generations because it helps us understand how people experience the United States differently. Before my grandma passed in October, my grandpa a year prior, we were 4 generations living in this place and in this time. I am the oldest granddaughter among almost 39 grandchildren on my maternal side, which is the stories that I'm focusing on, and about 20 great-grandchildren. There are 37.5 years between myself and the youngest grandchild, a span of time across which a great deal of knowledge and change resides. It is from this vantage point that I offer this talk, bearing witness to cultural and linguistic resilience, as well as the processes of acculturation unfolding before my eyes. I'm also the great-granddaughter of guest workers on both my paternal and maternal side. Like thousands of men from states such as Michoacan, where I was born, they were recruited as temporary laborers to this country. Michoacán de Ocampo continues to be one of the largest states of campesino labor to the United States. That is my great-grandfather, Miguel Sánchez Tovar. Immigration is not defined only by push factors such as violence or poverty. It is also shaped by the pull factors such as labor shortages during wartime and expansion of agriculture and industry. The story of Mexican immigration is often summarized with this phrase: We are pulled in when our labor is needed, and we are expelled when it no longer is, such as what happened in World War I, World War II, Korean War, and so on and so on. Although Mexican movement to the Northwest began in the 19th century, larger movements occurred in the earlier 20th century. As agriculture expanded in the Northwest, Mexican labor recruitment accelerated. Scholars such as Dr. Jerry Garcia, Dr. Gilberto Garcia, and other Chicano historians in this region have documented Mexican history in the Pacific Northwest in detail. The long and difficult Mexican Revolution of 1910 and 1920 had consequences that reached the Pacific Northwest. The Mexican diaspora pushed past the Southwest into this region. But Mexicans were both pushed and also pulled in the country, pushed by the loss of jobs and instability, and pulled by the expansion of agriculture and need for cheap labor. My great-grandfather, Miguel Sánchez Mares, was one of those Mexicans. Alongside his siblings recruited to meet the labor needs in the Southwest, and even the steel industries, particularly in the railroad in the Northeast, in areas like Pennsylvania and Indiana. He did not migrate with the intention of staying, but was part of the waves of Mexican men who arrived to the United States in the 1920s to work and then return home. His first recorded trip was at the age of 17. In 1920, when he arrived in Texas. My grandfather believed that his dad, so my great-grandfather, first worked in agriculture in that area before he joined other railroad workers in the 1930s. Although we cannot know with certainty, he likely endured the harsh and often violent treatment that many Mexican guest workers experienced at the border. After my great-grandfather Miguel worked in Texas as an agricultural laborer in the 1920s, he later was sent to the Northwest to work on the railroads, to work in the railroads. Records show crossings in 1920, 1925, 1929. So these are some documents. A second cousin of mine, Claudia Bovi, if she's watching, shout out to you, has done extensive research and finding historical documents from our great-grandfathers. And so it's been fun to kind of dive in and know more of the story of migration through that research. Mexican workers helped transform isolating ranching regions in Texas and other parts of the Southwest, and continued migration from Mexico helped launch an agricultural boom built on low wages in the 1910s and 1920s. The labor system later became a model for other parts of the nation, including the Northwest. My great-grandfather Miguel and my great-grandmother Concepcion Tobal That's my great-grandfather, Miguel. This is, we believe, 1929, when he was working in the railroad in Indiana. We believe that they were put on this nice suit for the picture, but the certificate of arrival just kind of demonstrated, again, the constant back and forth that he participated in. So my great-grandparents had 11 children. Their sons, including my grandfather, Morales-Sánchez, later joined the waves of migrants who traveled back and forth between Mexico and the United States as braceros. I'll talk more about that in a minute. My maternal great-grandfather participated in the program in its earlier years, and as did my paternal grandfather, Samuel Morales. Later, when he was in his 20s, my grandfather, Morales-Sánchez, participated in the bracero program in the 60s. Established by the Mexican Far Labor Program, the Bracero Program was a series of diplomatic accords between Mexico and the United States that permitted millions of Mexican men to work legally in the United States on a short-term labor contracts. It was meant to address the national agricultural labor shortage of World War II. But the program was also designed to redress Depression-era deportations and repatriations that unjustly targeted Mexican Americans, the majority of who were U.S. citizens. Such as the occurrence in 1954 that was called Operation Wetback, which sent over 1 million people back from California and Arizona to Mexico, majority of whom were U.S. citizens. The term bracero comes from brazo, meaning arm. It is one example of the ways that Mexican people have historically been valued only for their labor, in calling a program by brazo and arm, right? Working in the fields, but excluded in schools and excluded from decision-making spaces. and often seen as disposable. Immigrant people are often reduced to ahistorical figures, treated as perpetual foreigners, and frequently excluded from recognition as citizens, even when we are citizens. The perpetual foreigner stereotype suggests that members of ethnic minorities will always be seen as an other within the white Anglo-Saxon dominant society of the United States. The perception is rooted in a long history of exclusion, not only through physical removal, such as deportation, such as the Operation Wetback in 1954, detention and internment, but also through laws and policies that restricted citizenship to white people. Never mind the many contributions to the nation's economy and society built by the sweat of our brown Mexican labor. We are often portrayed as people defined only by poverty, by war, or the act of migration itself. Yet immigrant communities have deep and enduring histories in this region, in this continent, many of which predate those of neighbors whose belonging is rarely questioned. Thanks to the research of, again, my second cousin, Claudia Bovi, formerly Sanchez, granddaughter of my great uncle Benito Sanchez, who also recently passed, we can trace some of our ancestors on this continent as far back as the 1700s through the Spanish side of our story. This is a marriage license for my great-great-grandmother, Josefa Mares, and great-great-grandfather, Benedito Sanchez. Our mestizo identity is also shaped by indigenous ancestors who have always belonged in this territory of Michoacan for even longer than that. These images show parts of our story which did not begin with the crossing of the US-Mexico border. That is my great-great-grandmother on the left. Today, about 30%, that's a great uncle, two great uncles. Today, about 30% of Chelan County's population is Hispanic, compared to 13% in the state of Washington. The majority are of Mexican descent. Large numbers of Mexican people began arriving in the Pacific Northwest after the United States recruited thousands of Mexican braceros from 1942 to 1964, as I mentioned earlier, particularly during the labor shortages caused by the Second World War. As in earlier migrations, Mexican workers were drawn to the fertile lands of Washington that required a large agricultural labor force. There is a strong link between the growth of Latino populations and the development of the state's industries. My great-grandfather contributed to the communities from Texas to Pennsylvania to Indiana to Arizona through the labor of his hands. Similarly, his sons, beginning with my grandfather Baldomero Sánchez Tovar, began contributing to the agricultural sector in the United States during the 1960s. He worked as a bracero from 1961 to 1964. In an interview with him in 2018, he describes the process. In 1961, at 21 years old, he crossed the border. At the checkpoint, he was stripped down to his undergarments and sprayed with powder, which was DDT, a pesticide used to kill insects and that is now associated with serious long-term health risks. After this process, he was sent to work in the strawberry fields in Madera, California, and later the beet fields. When the contract ended, he returned to Mexico. In 1962, he returned again. The same process happened at the border, and he was sent to California to work the tomato fields before returning to Mexico. The same pattern continued the following year. In 1964, he was sent to Arizona to work harvesting melons and watermelons. Other men from our village, relatives of my grandfather, were braceros in the Pacific Northwest during the same time. Dr. Jerry Garcia writes about migration, quote, they were a reliable source of labor in the Northwest. And every fall, this region fell into panic over loss of workers or lack of workers. The North Central Washington became the beneficiary of thousands of imported Mexican nationals from 1943 to 1947, a period that represents the arrival of the first large-scale movement of Mexicans into the North Central Washington region. Communities such as Wenatchee, Quincy, Moses Lake, and Okanagan each utilized braceros to harvest their crops. By the late 1950s and 60s, well-established Mexican communities were visible in the north central Washington region. When the Bracero program ended in 1964, my grandfather did not return to the US until 1967. After that, he continued the cycle of migration, the coming and the going, sending as much money back to my grandma in the form of remittances as possible. But this time, he was off contract. He was doing this coming and going as an undocumented worker. He worked until immigration authorities caught him and sent him back. During those years, he lived avoiding immigration enforcement and deportation. But getting caught in those days, as he tells me in our conversations, was not the same as getting caught today. You'd be sent to the border, and then you'd buy a ticket to take you back to Michoacan. Crossing back again was different. The crossing was not as arduous as it is today. People didn't die crossing in the same numbers we see today. Today, my grandpa says, people get detained. In those days, you just get deported. There were no detention in the same ways that we see today. In 1971, my abuelito was recruited back to Wapato, where he picked pears and apples for 3 months before immigration authorities detained him and deported him back. He returned in 1975, by which several of his 13 children had been born. He worked so he had 13 children, and my mom is in the back, and she's the second eldest. He worked in Peshastin, then was recruited to Brewster, then to Oregon, and finally returned to Peshastin in 1976 before working in Kashmir. Orchards in Kashmir and the surrounding areas were originally family-run businesses, planted in the late 1800s. By the mid-20th century, the workforce was replaced by Mexican laborers, first as braceros and later as undocumented workers, drawn in by the labor shortages and the demand for inexpensive labor. Sorry, y'all. Let me go back to that previous one. Okay. So migrant social networks played a critical role in these migration patterns, especially when people began to settle. These networks are what influences people to choose where they migrate to. When my grandfather arrived in this valley in the 1970s, there were already relatives and people here from our village of San Isidro in the state of Michoacan. One example is Agustin Tovar, a first cousin of my grandfather who had been contracted to work in Kashmir and was living in the barracks as a bracero and into the 50s. My grandfather also experienced living in similar barrack-style conditions while working as an undocumented migrant worker. My grandpa recalls that in the 70s and early 80s were difficult years. During one period, immigration enforcement was so intense that the workers were forced to remain inside the barracks. They could not go out shopping. Their boss would shop for them, bring all the necessary supplies. He said he would bring us potatoes and vegetables and foods, but not tortillas. Tortillas were hard to find in those days, he said, and even masa was difficult to get. It was hard not to have a staple food such as that for them. They were told to stay inside and keep their windows closed. They spent days moving only between the orchards and the barracks, or las cabinas, living in constant fear. In 1986, I want to point back to this because of that, President Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, a bipartisan agreement that provided amnesty for many established residents who had arrived before 1981. The policy also increased border enforcement, strengthened employer requirements, and expanded guest worker visa programs. If immigrants met certain conditions, including continuous residence in the United States since January 1982, had no serious criminal background, they could apply for the amnesty. They would first receive a temporary work permit and eventually a permanent resident card. Thanks to this amnesty, my grandparents, most of my aunts and uncles, my parents, siblings, well, my brother and I, my sister was born here, and I were able to obtain legal documentation. It was an actual path to permanent residency. Our access to documentation was not because we were more deserving than those who remain undocumented today. Without that, my mom, my brother, and I could have easily been living as many of our undocumented neighbors and relatives are today. Many people remain undocumented for complex structural reasons. The impact of this policy in the Valley mirrored what happened in many other communities around the country. Workers like my grandfather and his siblings were able to obtain legal status and eventually permanent residency. Many later became citizens and pursued education, such as GEDs. and then open more opportunities for them to be fully integrated into society. However, the program also had challenges. Although the law was passed, there were gaps in the implementation and in spreading information about the amnesty. In the Valley, the news spread largely by word of mouth. Migrants themselves shared information through social networks and helped each other complete the paperwork. For my grandfather, the key person was his nephew, Chava, the son of his brother, Everardo, or Lalo, who had obtained a position as a foreman in an orchard in Royal City and had access to information and resources in that position that other workers did not. The application required a proof of identity and a proof of employment, but because many farm workers had been paid in cash, the program allowed, until they could have proof of employment, it did allow for sworn statements or affidavits. Chava provided those affidavits for my grandfather and many other people in this community, confirming their employment and residency. In many ways, he was the reason many did not miss the opportunity to obtain legal residency. So those pictures are, my grandparents. That's my grandpa picking cherries before he retired from the cherry orchards. Hispanic immigrants, the majority who are Mexican, have been a major driver of economic expansion in this region. In 2006, the Washington's governor at the time, Christine Gregory, stated that the economy, quote, lives and breathes through agriculture, an industry in which at least 60% of the workforce is immigrant labor. The majority of that workforce is Latina or Latino. Today, even though in the first waves of migration, it was mostly men, when in IRCA was signed in, reunification, women and children then came over to the valley as well. Today, women dominate the packing sheds, sorting and packing and moving the fruit that sustains the valley's agricultural economy. It's a picture of my grandfather and his house in Kashmir. By the 1990s, local newspapers were already recognizing the demographic and economic impact of this community. Articles in the Wenatchee World described the Hispanic population as a, quote, newly found consumer market. They were good consumers, they said. But what those articles only partially captured was something deeper. This was not just a labor force or a market, it was a community putting down roots. The shift was closely tied to the effects of IRCA. Many immigrants who had previously been migrant workers were able to settle more permanently and bring their families, women and children. My grandpa did the same when he brought my grandmother, Sara Aviña, and most of their children to Washington. She immediately joined the workforce as a pear sorter in a packing shed in Peshastin, which she retired from. When my grandma first arrived, she hated it here. She missed the sense of community and connection in her hometown. Even with the struggle she had faced there, she felt more free than she did here. But before she passed away this October, we talked about the feeling of home. She told me that she no longer missed San Isidro the way she once had. Like my grandpa, she found home where her family was, and that was here. Despite the challenges she endured, they decided to stay because of the pueblito of Kashmir became their home. They were acculturated but not assimilated, able to then pass on values to 3 generations. In 1998, my grandfather, a man who had once been illiterate and learned to read and write, from comrades he met during the years of migration, bought a house in Kashmir. It's actually the previous slide. That was the house that he bought. This continues to impress me, considering the difficulty of a home buying, home shopping system, bank loans and all that stuff. In one of our many conversations, I asked him how he had learned to read and write and if he never went to school. His literacy, his awareness of world politics, and his interest in reading the news would make anyone believe that he was a quote-unquote educated man. He responded simply saying, "Me enseñaron," they taught me, the people I work with in the fields and in the orchards. The camaraderie and solidarity he shared with his compañeros moving from field to field, orchard to orchard, became essential to their survival through difficult conditions. Along with that solidarity was their determination to earn enough money to send back to their families. These values were nurtured here, but they are rooted in the collectivism that Mexican campesinos have long practiced. Reciprocity, the exchange of ideas, care, material support for mutual benefit and resourcefulness. The assets we bring to our communities have been passed down through generations of migrant workers, guest workers, and immigrants. Oh, I didn't change that, sorry. This is, I don't know, we can click on the video, but this is a picture. My mom is probably gonna say, why did you have me up there? It's my mom in the 80s before she migrated. This is me and my brother before we came to the United States. And this is just a very short clip of pear packing, which my mom and aunt still do. And just sort of, it's 10 seconds, maybe even less. Try to imagine yourselves, would you be able to do this? It's hard work, it's fast work, it's skilled work, it's a lot. In my doctoral research conducted in 2013, I focused on the experiences of migrant children who worked alongside their parents in cherry orchards during their summer breaks, children from this very valley. I was interested in how they described their identity as children of immigrants, what that meant to them, and how they understood the reality that the majority of the workers in the orchards were Mexican. I wanted to understand what this taught them about race, class, and immigration. On one hand, some children showed signs of internalizing the narrative that Mexicans belong only in the orchards and the fields and not in schools because they are, quote, good workers. On the other hand, they demonstrated an incredible and mature concern for the collective well-being. They reminded me the same values of solidarity and reciprocity and care that sustained my grandfather and his compañeros in the fields and that sustained my grandma in the packing sheds when she arrived in the 90s. Then my aunt and my mother, who, like many Mexican and Latina women, continue to dominate in this sector. Thank you. And this story is, and that story is not unique, it's one of many. What immigrants bring with them is not only labor. What we bring is not only labor. We carry community-based ways of thinking that help build and sustain resilience, connection, and economic and cultural vitality. These are the pieces of home that travel with us. We carry the resilience that allowed our ancestors to survive colonization, poverty, and displacement, and we carry what scholar Luis Urrieta calls community-based saberes, the forms of knowledge rooted in family and community and lived experience that are passed down across generations and connected to indigenous ancestral ways of knowing. From this point, my grandfather and grandmother were educated beings. These saberes or knowings teach us how to care for extended families, how to build networks of mutual support, and how to adapt and survive in new places. They are knowledge systems that travel with us where we migrate, helping us build lives in places with different languages and rigid structures that often contrast with the collective spaces many of us come from. These pictures were taken in the 80s. This is a whole nother story, but recently learned that an anthropologist in the 80s conducted a study and focused on some of my relatives, and so she wanted to understand how people post-IRCA were impacted living in Wenatchee. So she went back to San Isidro, the village where my family's from, my maternal family, and took images, but then she shared these to my family and gave them, said, here's the pictures that I took for this. I haven't found her study, I'm still sort of wanting to read that. But so these are pictures of my family and relatives before they all, like the whole village, I would say, of San Isidro is now in Wenatchee. It's sort of what happens, it's all transplanted here. Those are uncles. And part of why I love these images, and to me it's this idea of carrying home, is because, you know, there was poverty and there was struggle, but there's so much knowledge in that right there. And the people are, the resiliency, my mom tells me, they would all hop on this really old bus to get to the city to do some shopping to the pueblo, and then just being in the village, and then everybody would gather together and be together and be together, and the idea of community and collectivity. And then the bottom is the milpa, cornfields, and so all of that is part of that knowledge that we carry and we bring with us here. So with that, to conclude, we are not people without histories. Like all of you, we carry histories and ties to this land and to this continent. In many cases, those ties stretch back centuries, sometimes longer than those some of our neighbors. So when I talk about immigration and belonging in the Wenatchee Valley, we are not only talking about movement across border, labor, or the pull and push factors. We're talking about the ways people work to build strong communities, not only in the economy, but also in schools and neighborhoods. Belonging in this valley is a reality, built through decades of presence and labor and community building by Mexican immigrants and by the many neighbors who share this place, the homeland of the Cobol and the Puscosa people. And with that, I conclude. Thank you. Thank you. So just know, this is, as you know, I focus on my maternal grandparents. Both have passed now. My grandma passed in October, and my grandpa a year ago. Although I don't speak much about my paternal grandfather, he too was a bracero. That's a whole story, but it's also in honor of him. And yeah, so I think we have some time for questions.
We do. So we have microphones on both sides of the room. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll hand you the mic and go from there. We have a question in the front.
Hi, Maria. That was incredible. Thank you. My question is two parts. How would you define your sense of belonging in the Valley after having lived here for so long? And what do you hope for your nephew's generation as their sense of belonging when they think about it?
Good question. How do I define my sense of belonging? I think it's both kind of like ongoing. It's both, I hear like what I said is a fact, and I think in doing this, realizing it's not just something we're seeking, but like we belong here because all of the stories. I think it's something that I still sort of internalize and struggle with at times, right? But the community, so to me it is defined by community and people. It's not just like my family and my kin who are here, but the relationships and the networks that I've built. So I define it as relational, the people, the place. This place is now full of stories. So to me, belonging is all like the stories that you said in a place kind of contributes to that sense of belonging, I think. Thank you. Any other questions?
Got one right here. More of a comment. Thank you very much. It's really lovely to see your history and your family there as well. I think a lot of it resonated with me. I am an immigrant twice, I suppose twice over. My parents immigrated from Europe to Canada, and then I immigrated down to the United States by myself. And so the ideas of both carrying home and also, you know, this sense of trying to find your place and your belonging is resonated very deeply with me. And I'm curious what you, like, part of the narrative is of people not belonging or of kind of needing to sort of define space for yourself as someone from another. But I think a lot of what your discussion kind of brought up for me was how really the story of immigration is about, like, it's generative, it's very cultivating to bring together, you know, different histories and different perspectives and different people. And I'm curious if you were to redefine the narrative of, you know, immigration in a more generative sense, how would you do that?
Great, big question. Stay posted for the next talk. I mean, I think that's part of what I was hoping to do with this is that, like, I think we all kind of believe at some level that, like, yes, this is a country of immigrants in the sense that, like, most of us, except for Indigenous folks, First Nations people, like, this is their territory and their place. It's also, like, an idea that doesn't necessarily doesn't align with how people from different backgrounds are treated. Like even when they're immigrants, someone that comes from a European country versus someone that comes from a country in Latin America, specifically an impoverished country, there are more people of color. So I think there's like the idea that like we are a country of immigrants versus the practice. And so I think that like reconciling that would be important. Like we're not, what it would look like to not just say that to not talk but practice it. And in part it's not just like the community building and the work that we do with each other, but also like doing the learning and the history and like I think that's really important, right? It's not just that like we love each other and we treat each other as a diverse community, but also learn and read and understand how different people in history have been treated, because those are the things that we're still unlearning today. Like when I talk about the dominant narrative, it's stuff that adds up, sort of like the subtle messages all add up to form a discourse around belonging, right? And Mexican people, even though we've been here, as I said, in this region, and in the Southwest, I mean, there's people, and there's that saying, right, that we didn't cross the border crossed us, because there was like thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the Southwest that were there when the land was taken by the United States. Even though there's people that have been here and are part of, there's still always sort of this question of belonging, like you're still not from here. And I think that we all need to collectively do this work to unlearn that and know like where that comes from, and that's very racialized, very discriminatory. Yeah, thank you.
We have a question over here.
Maria, you talked about your family in the past. What about the future? How do you see your family and the community growing and developing?
Thank you, Penny. Well, it was both the past and the now, right? Like a lot of my grandparents, but today, bringing that story forward is part of my goal, so thank you for that. I mean, it's right here. Like me, I mentioned my large extended family, and the loss of my grandparents was a big moment for us, because it was, I mean, this part of the story and figuring out what to do and how to carry that forward. But they leave, like I said, a large family, and that's just like my great-grandfather had 10, 11 children, and many of those also are here, and their own clusters of people. So I guess I think of like, for me personally, how do I see the future is carrying this forward and carrying these memories of where these lands that we come from is important for us, because I think that helps us keep this connection and keep us rooted and grounded. So I think looking forward, there's that. But I also see and hope that many of us continue to do what we've been doing in my generation and like older generations, which is be in all the places. I mean, we have now in my generation, I have second cousins who are now in the professional sector spaces, so there's a shift. So I didn't talk a lot about that, but the shift of manual labor, agriculture, to now being in these professional spaces, from folks in my family who are principals in schools and teachers to folks that are working in the PUD. I have a lot of, so now we're entering just different and integrating in the community. So that's the present and the future, I think, continuing that while honoring these roots that we come from. Thank you.
How much racism did you experience in your academic career?
I'm so sorry, I didn't hear the question.
How much racism did you experience during your academic career?
Whoa, how much racism did I experience? That's a great question, but a lot. Oftentimes, most of the times it was microaggressions, like subtle. I think the first time that I really saw myself as an other, even though I talk about all this love and they taught us to love this valley, I did go to Kashmir High School, and I experienced, when I moved here, I experienced a huge difference from that to where I went to the first couple of years in high school in the East Bay in California. It's the first time that I saw myself as Latina or like as different, because the diversity was very stark, white and Latinos, right? But there was microaggressions or things like, you know, I don't see you going to college. You know, the best you can do is Wenatchee Valley, which, no disrespect, and now I work here, look at that. But I think what was hard about that was that I was told that's my only path. So I experienced stuff like that in high school, even being told not to speak Spanish. I've experienced stuff like that. In college and in grad school, there were other microaggressions, very intense microaggressions as well from people who would say things like, oh, we read about this, but like when you experience it, it's hard. Like I was told by a colleague who also was a doctoral student, we're both in the program, that I was super articulate, right? And so like, I've been here since I'm 5 years old, and so I've experienced stuff like that in microaggressions in subtle but very intense ways throughout my career, my journey. Yeah, thank you for the question.
So you talked about experiencing the Valley sort of as an other, being like an other from the white community, I guess in particular. I was curious, like, since as you've spent a long time here, like both as a local and as an academic, I wondered if you would be able to characterize like how integration between like the white and the Latino communities have looked here, like during your lifetime. How has that changed? How much, the degree of separation and the degree of integration between those communities and what it's looked like?
Yeah, I think that could go on. I'm happy to have a conversation with you afterwards about. I think that's integration. So sorry, I'm not at the last part of your question. How we have our integration has shifted, looks differently.
Yeah, just the degree to which those communities are separate, and the degree to which they are, they interface, that they're integrated.
Yeah.
I feel like that's not quite the right word, but.
Yeah, if I'm understanding, I think in my experience, it's been, now I think I can see a lot more integration in the sense that like participating Latinos are increasing business owners in the Valley. I don't have an exact number, but when my grandpa talked about there was no tiendita in those days and there was no place to get tortillas, today there are many of those places. So I think there's there is a growth in terms of Latino integration and becoming business owners and being part of community. I think different waves of European migration I experienced those sort of similar kind of challenges. I couldn't tell you to what extent. I think that there's also a lot of separation. Like in my growing up or going to school in Kashmir in the area, there was a big separation between white populations, white students, and Latinos. There's huge separation. And there was you either were a newcomer that still spoke Spanish, is still connected to your Mexican roots, or you were somebody that spoke English, but then were more associated to whiteness. So like in order to be okay and survive and do okay and have good grades and have good relationships, in my experience, you had to be less Latino and be less Mexican and speak more English than Spanish. So then you had to choose. It's sort of my experience growing up. I think today, because demographic increase, because there's more diversity in schools, because the curriculum, thankfully, is becoming a little bit more diverse, I think some of that is shifting and it's a little bit more of relational work.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. Do you have a question? We have a question right here.
Hi, it's good to see you. Thank you for sharing your story. Quick question, because I see a lot of young faces in the back. I think continuously we will go through these moments where we don't belong or where we're made to not belong. Mm-hmm. What are the things that you hold on to, or what are the things that help remind you and the people around you that this is home, that you belong here? Mm. What are the things that you attach to or look towards in order to remind yourself and then those around you that this mm-hmm. is home also?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I feel like we all should ask ourselves that question. For me, it is memories, because I am, like I said, first-gen immigrant. I crossed the border. I have my own lived experience and the memories of that, but I also have memories of stories from my mom, from my grandparents, of not just the crossing, but what life was like in Mexico and what life was like when they were in a land that they called theirs. And I think there's something about holding on to those stories and the idea that we're not in this territory that our ancestors were in, but you can build family in a new place, so long as you hold on to each other as kinship, as family, chosen family, and you tell stories. So like stories, so I hold on to stories and storytelling, and memories, food and practices. Like I keep saying tortillas, but I think it's also like there's symbolism behind that. Like you hold on to these things that root you and ground you. And for me, no matter how far I go in what direction, I will still grab my chile verde and my tortillas and my molcajete. And like that's still something that holds on because I grew up with that, but also because I understand the cultural significance of still having something like that hundreds of years after colonization, right? To still hold on to all these things. So stories, storytelling, relationships, memories, yeah. And jotting those down for me. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question, if we have one. Going once, going twice. Please join us in congratulating and thanking Maria for tonight's presentation.
He's been really wanting to talk. Thank you so much.
One, two, three.
Stay tuned for the next lecture by Tiago. This is my nephew.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all for coming.
Please join us next.
Thank you for the flowers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
So much about your
Yeah.
family, your life, your experience.
Yeah, that was a lot of me. That was a lot of.
Thanks for coming.
Excuse me.
Oh, I know what you're doing. I don't know if it's going to be the same.